This week, special elections in Wisconsin and Florida. Some read it as a political weather vane. Our panel weighs in. Can toddlers be transphobic? Apparently so, if one preschool is to be believed. And one of those stranded astronauts returns to Earth and says he spent a lot of time with God. These stories and much more straight ahead on The Lion Week in Review. Welcome into this week's edition of The Lion Week in Review. It's a weekly look at the culture, the courts, your state capitol, and your kids. I'm Chris Stigall. Now, let's meet our panel. Some of the men and women behind the stories at readlion.com. Josh Mann is our managing editor, Michael Ryan, executive editor, and Valerie Cabana is our media contributor here at The Lion. Panel, welcome to all of you as we dive into some of your headlines this week. I guess first we tackle the special elections in Wisconsin and Florida. And Josh, I start with you. Any takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, these were major elections, some considered a barometer of some of the Trump administration's policies. In Florida, there were two U.S. congressional seats that had been vacated by Trump cabinet picks, and these were important for Republicans to maintain a solid majority, and for Trump himself, who doesn't have much wiggle room in the House. And the GOP took both of those seats. In Wisconsin, Trump also scored a win in a sense because Wisconsin overwhelmingly passed voter ID requirements. And so this has been a big part of Trump's agenda. And, this is polling great nationwide. Americans largely agree that we need to make sure that the people voting are legally doing so. And then the one win for the Dems was the Supreme Court justice there in Wisconsin, a Democrat who may sway the court to basically open the door to redistricting there, which could lead to congressional losses for Republicans in the medium term.
Yeah, there's a lot that people are trying to read into this, Michael. I don't know how you come away from Wisconsin in particular that voter ID passes, but a fairly left-leaning judge on the Supreme Court passes also.
It's a real head-scratcher. The Supreme Court race was technically nonpartisan, but not really, and the Democrat-backed candidate won. And a lot of people are wondering, how does that happen when the candidate was backed by a party with approval ratings in the 20s? And after the previous government that we just let go of in January, their censorship regime, the attempts to eliminate their political rival, the human trafficking over the border, and the resulting murders and rapes of American women and children, and the assaults on people of faith. I mean, this is just months removed from all that. It's stunning.
One of the great stories this week at readlion.com, one of my favorites, one that will make you smile regardless of your politics, I think. That is, if you're a person of faith. Valerie, these astronauts that were stranded up in space for almost 9 months. Butch, I believe, was one of the astronauts who's been making a lot of news.
Yes, he has been outspoken when it comes to his faith. In fact, he attended church online every week through his home church in Texas while he was stranded in space. This is a really cool story that you guys have got to check out on The Line. He's being so outspoken and really making moves.
I don't know, Josh, how you feel about this, but it does seem to me like ever increasingly in various sectors of society, be it sports, be it politics, be it astronauts, we're hearing stories of faith. Never a bad thing, particularly for those of us who are Christians.
That's right. I mean, he's become my favorite astronaut. I don't know if folks have one, but I would commend him to those without a favorite astronaut to date. He's brilliant. I mean, as astronauts are. He, in the press conference he gave Monday, where he talked again about his faith, he's been talking about it really for the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks since he landed back to Earth. He just credited God and the knowledge that God has a plan even when his human plans fail. And so it's a great example, I think, to people of faith, but also a great example of just seeing a Christian in culture, in STEM, in space exploration, living out their faith. I think it's something that every Christian in any sphere of life or any vocation can emulate.
It's an interesting point Josh makes, Michael, because so often we hear that people of faith and science don't mix. Here's a perfect example of where it certainly does.
Yeah, let me just say it was one small step for man, one giant leap for people of faith, to hear what he had to say. You know, with God increasingly absent in the public schools and the public square and church attendance being what it is, We absolutely desperately need more expressions of faith and worship from public figures like Butch. There's a great line in the movie Bridge of Spies where a guy is facing the death penalty, and he seems to be really calm, and his lawyer, played by Tom Hanks, says, "Aren't you worried?" And the guy says, "Would it help?" And that's a good question. It wouldn't help, but trust me, I'm from a long line of worriers, and what he said about worrying, not worrying about things that you can't control and leaving it to God, really touched me.
Valerie, this is one that I couldn't wait to ask you about. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, made an announcement this week that in terms of combat readiness for his troops under his command, they've all got to pass the same standards, be they male or be they female. You say?
I think that's exactly how it should be. Women and men in combat have to be upheld to the same standards, because if there is a weak link in combat, it puts those people that might not be weak links at danger. You all have to be one fluid system working together, because you're not only protecting your own life, but you're protecting the lives of those other people who are in combat with you.
J.K. Rowling, across the pond. Michael, this is one of those wild stories that she continues to sound off on because it's insane. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. I don't know what person looks at a story like this and thinks it's not insane, although she's the one that seems to be continually under fire from European governments for very sane things that she says, at least to the rest of us. What do you know?
So we learned that a toddler in a nursery was basically called out for transphobia in the UK a couple of years ago. And it turns out that 94 students in the early grades there have been suspended or expelled for so-called transphobia or homophobia. It is hilarious if it weren't so obscenely insane. Labeling toddlers public enemies for getting sex wrong. And what I think about most when I read this story is the scars that will leave those toddlers. I mean, how would that affect their personal development, their growth, and their sense of self through the years? I mean, they've been labeled a scofflaw, a public enemy. Never mind transphobia. I think they're going to probably end up being afraid of everything.
And Rowling is a woman who, probably one of the biggest pop culture figures, I suppose, in that part of Europe. Josh, you know a little about this. You've also raised toddlers. You have some toddlers. First of all, the notion that toddlers are even conscious of things like this, and that it takes somebody like Rowling to call attention to it, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the toddlers are the last humans left with common sense. They haven't been indoctrinated yet by the crazy woke culture that they're born into today. It's absurd. Rowling has, she has been very outspoken the past few years for women's rights. She's not the most conservative person on every issue, but she has a lot of common sense, and she has been very brave to speak out. Now, she, in some sense, maybe she can afford to do so, but people like that, it's important. It reminds me of Elon Musk. People who are in positions of power and influence, perhaps because of wealth they've created, need to be speaking out, because if they're not, then the people who really can't afford to won't. And so, kudos to her.
Valerie, this stuff generally always happens over there. I say over there, meaning Europe. It always seems to wind up here. Do you see a day the American toddlers are being called haters and transphobic?
I hope that we've reached a point in our American society where people are starting to wake up. I think Donald Trump winning the election is a big step forward in that direction. So no, I'm going to go with we're not going to see that day here. If we do, I will be extremely shocked. I think the issue of the transgender movement is why Democrats lost the election altogether.
Michael, your colleague Adam Wittenberg wrote a story that 8 states, only 8, are left in the union that are untouched or not really warming to or have not really embraced at least a discussion or debate about school choice, which I thought was pretty interesting. Only 8.
Yeah, and Adam's story, I talked to Adam earlier today, and I told him what a great story it was, what an important story it was, because everybody across the country, especially those involved in the education freedom movement, need to read that story because it really highlights where we are now and where we're headed. I just imagine, the freedom broke out in the colonies, but it didn't do it all at once. It did it a little bit at a time, and it wasn't really cataloged as well as we could do it today. And Adam's story does that. It catalogs basically freedom breaking out across the country from coast to coast. And I have to think that Randy Weingarten is feeling a little bit like King George today because the colonists are not obeying. We're free in almost every other aspect of our lives. We should be free in the most important, which is education.
Josh, is this one of those snowballs rolling downhill that's just picked up too much momentum, can't be stopped? Or do you think there's still a possibility that people thwart school choice nationally?
I'm not entirely sure, but I lean towards snowball that can't be stopped because I think COVID really set the ball rolling. I mean, there was snow on the ground, there was a ball formed, but COVID kind of created the hill that it needed to really gain momentum. And I don't really see how you put the cat back in the bag. I think a lot of families are seeing the benefits of school choice, and so they're sold on it. It's polling well. If Texas passes school choice, which it is looking like it will, then nearly half of all kids in the U.S. will have some form of school choice. And I don't think you get that back. I think people are going to see the benefits, and it's just going to grow from there.
Then you start talking about states losing populations to those who have school choice, and then they'll force the issue probably. Panel, great discussion. Thank you. Great stories. When we return, we wade through some of the sound and sights on Capitol Hill and cable news on television as the Lion Week in Review rolls on next. Sit tight. Welcome back to the Lion Week in Review. If you missed any of today's show, or you're interested in going back and hearing more or seeing more of this great news, you can always check it out at readlion.com or listen to us on YouTube. All right, panel, let's start with the special elections in Wisconsin and Florida once again. We return to that subject, specifically the funding of this Wisconsin election. It's an interesting discussion that unfolded on CNN after we got the returns in that the Democrat-favored candidate ended up winning there in Wisconsin. The CNN panel discussed the funding effort and the involvement of people like Elon Musk and others in that race. Take a listen to the discussion.
Well, what's interesting about it is you heard anytime anybody brings this up, a Republican will say, well, what about J.B. Pritzker, and what about George Soros, and what about this, what about that? And I guess the answer is you don't see George. First of all,
George Soros
you don't see them out there talking.
Yeah. No.
Right? I mean, they might be giving money to organizations, this and that, and people can criticize that if they want. But the idea that, like, oh no, I am going to tell these voters, forget like hiring Scott Walker to do it or somebody on the Milwaukee Bucks. I'm going to tell them.
All right, so the thrust of that is Jake Tapper is saying Elon Musk is uniquely offensive because he physically went to Wisconsin, he stood on the stage, he got personally involved, and basically he doesn't belong there, Michael. But somehow that's different than J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, or different than George Soros because they don't, go stand on a stage?
Yeah, I think it's arguable that it's more admirable to be upfront and public about it. But, the left has made a living in recent years funneling money to not only elections, but also nonpartisan election offices around the country to try to swing things their way, and also to judicial races and even attorney general's offices. And all this is cataloged very well in a book called Socialists Don't Sleep by Cheryl Chumley of the Washington Times. They're just throwing a lot of money up there, and I think this is what happened in Wisconsin.
Elon Musk is offensive because he gets involved in these elections, Josh. Does it bother you?
Well, I thought people didn't like dark money, so Elon's actually it's white money or bright money because he's being very transparent. He is putting his mouth where his money is, and so this is America. First Amendment. This guy seems to really believe in the things he's funding, and it's not just, it's not just a bigger political machine that's sort of murky and you don't really know what's happening. You know exactly what's happening, and so I commend him for it. I don't see why we should be worried about it.
Here's the thing. We stick with CNN for a minute because, and you touched on it earlier in the show, there's a ton of money being spent in this race. We know that. I looked at the figures. It looks like about 1 million fewer people participated in this Supreme Court race than did the presidential election of 2024. So about 1 million fewer. And yet, while the favored Democrat candidate won, Democrats as a party have never been less popular. Listen.
Voters' views of the Democrats in Congress among all voters disapprove 68%,
And look at the approved number, just 21%, even lower than the Democratic Party at large. This is the lowest on record for Democrats, according to Quinnipiac University polling. You think these numbers are bad? Let's go to this side of the screen. We'll look how Democratic voters feel. Get this. The plurality of Democratic voters disapprove of Democrats in Congress at 49%, and just 40% approve. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Oh, my goodness gracious, you just can't get worse than these numbers.
I think I have a thought on this, but Democrats have never been less popular historically, and yet somehow they're thought to have done well in the special election in Wisconsin. I think the answer might be in the data he just shared. Michael?
Well, yeah. And I go back to the fact that this is a populist revolution, and no revolution is won on the first shot. And I wonder if... And remember that President Trump won a popular vote victory and a majority of the states, electoral college victory. So this is not a narrow kind of question. I mean, this was an overriding win. And I think a lot of people are sitting back now who voted for this revolution and think it's over and think they won. And it's never over, especially when you have so many forces allied against it. I mean, you're talking about the federal bureaucracy. You're talking about intelligence agencies. You're talking about the media. You're talking about the Democrat Party. You're talking about international socialists who are funneling money and other influence throughout our election system. So they're trying to strangle this revolution in its crib, and they just may do it.
To that point, and Valerie, I'll get your comment on the other side of this clip from Scott Jennings. He's kind of the lone conservative on CNN, and he's been trying to explain to most of his colleagues there on the set why elections like this are so important and why Republicans should not sleep on them. Take a watch.
What is the end of Western civilization? Explain that.
I mean, it is the future of Western civilization all over this world is in the balance right now. When you look at what's going on in Europe, they're throwing political opposition in jail. Free speech is under assault everywhere you turn. I mean, everything that we have built in this country, the tenets of Western civilization, the fundamental values that the country has been built on, Republicans and conservatives believe are under assault. The November election was the beginning of the pushback on that assault, but it's not over.
They figured it out in November, slept on it on Tuesday. Democrats never been more angry at their own party, but clearly highly motivated. Isn't that the point?
Yeah, I think everything that he said was spot on. They do seem highly motivated, but I think in this past election, a lot of Democrats flipped the script and they're not going with it anymore. It looks different on different issues. People vote Democrat on one issue, but they might not on another. We know that in the presidential election, a lot of Democrats voted for Donald Trump because of different, really crazy, radical issues. And so I can see why Democrats would then vote Democratic once again.
And of course, Josh, I mean, that's, it's an interesting point because voter ID passed. So you got to assume that some Democrat voters who voted for Trump voted for voter ID and voted for this judge. Maybe all three, probably.
Yeah, I'd like to see exit polling on this. I wonder a little bit if some of the media coverage of these district judges who've opposed Trump has influenced voters. I know I've got a lot of liberal friends on social media who really believe that Trump is just, basically giving the middle finger to the judicial branch. And there's very little nuance among these friends anyway about the real separations of power arguments that even the Trump administration's making. I wonder if Democrats are rallying a little bit around their judicial, progressive types. But I think I'd like to see exit polling on it. I also think April elections are notorious for low turnouts, and it can be pretty easy for opposition, even when the opposition's kind of in a bad state, to win. And so I think that's probably part of it too.
And clearly there doesn't seem to be any real front runner or leader for Democrats right now, which is why I suspect we saw this out of Cory Booker this week on the Senate floor.
Would the senator yield for a question?
Chuck Schumer, it's the only time in my life I can tell you no.
I just want to tell you a question. Do you know you have just broken the record Do you know how proud this caucus is of you? Do you know how proud America is of you?
Yeah, longest floor speech in Senate history. I don't really know what was covered, Michael. Do you? What the point was? I think it's just simply to get some headlines. Truth be told, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chris. I fell asleep in the first hour, so I missed most of it. It's sound and fury signifying nothing. I'm not sure what principle or policy or cause he was standing up for. I don't think anybody knows outside of that chamber. If you ask people on the street about it, they probably don't even know who he is, much less that he did this. He's not, I'm reminded of, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Jimmy Stewart's, courageous filibuster to save, a Boy Scout camp, basically. I knew Jimmy Stewart. Cory Booker, you are no Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah, not exactly a modern-day Frank Capra film there in the Senate. All right, Trump called Wednesday of this week Liberation Day, rolling out a series of new tariff proposals. J.D. Vance continues to be one of his fiercest attack dogs, if you want, doing some block and tackle out there. Here's what he said about his boss's plans.
Trump has said is that he wants to level the playing field. For decades, Canadian leadership has forced American farmers and American manufacturers to play by an unfair set of rules. All President Trump has said is that we're done playing by an unfair set of rules. If you're going to do something to our industries, then we're going to do something back to your industries. That's how you protect American manufacturing, and that's how you protect American jobs. Now, what I'd say to the American people is look, the president ran on this, and he said very clearly that we're done being the piggy bank of the entire world. For 40 years, in the same way that our European friends, I think, have neglected international security, for 40 years, a lot of our friends all over the world have used America as a piggy bank. They have used us to absorb all of their excess economic production. What does that mean for Americans? For Americans, that's meant manufacturing jobs declining. That's meant middle-class wages going down. That's meant whole towns that have been hollowed out by empty factories.
And so the question, Valerie, is, does this work? Do most Americans agree with J.D. Vance? And do they have the patience, by the way, to watch an economy that may not quite rebound as strongly as it has in the past? Maybe some hiccups economically even.
Patience, I'm going to say no. I don't think that the American people are going to have a ton of patience when it comes to this, especially not the left. I think the right will have a lot more patience. I love that Donald Trump lays out what's going to happen, and then J.D. Vance comes in with the knowledge and he explains it thoroughly. I think that makes them a really, really great team. I'm excited to see what happens from this, and I think time will tell.
How about you, Josh? Patience?
Well, we're going to need patience. I think one of the important reasons they've given is actually national security, and we can't lose sight of the fact that when we lose manufacturing, for example, things like steel in the steel industry, we're actually relying on countries like China to manufacture the raw resources we need for defense. So think about that. Some of what we're doing is leveling the playing field to bring manufacturing back, to grow that industry, which will provide jobs. It's an economic benefit, but this is also a national security issue. And so we're going to need patience. I hope it works out. I hope they can grow. The manufacturing industry particularly, I think, is important. But America's going to have to save a little money, maybe be a little frugal, and be patient.
I'd be remiss if I didn't get this in for Michael today. Jasmine Crockett, the Democrat from Texas, appearing on a radio show called The Breakfast Club, had some criticisms of a fellow black member of Congress named Byron Donalds, the Republican from Florida. Take a listen.
And if we continue to put people into office, and that even means some of our skinfolk who definitely are not our kinfolk, such as Byron Donalds, who are going to continue to say that, the fact that you sitting around talking about life was better under Jim Crow, is this because you don't understand history? Or literally it's because you married a white woman and so you think that whitewashed you? I'm not really sure, what it is.
Skinfolk, not our kinfolk. Michael, you married a white lady. Is that why I don't agree with you? I mean, I won't add anymore. How about you?
Wow, skinfolk and whitewashing. I thought we kind of settled this with Spencer Tracy Guess who's coming to dinner? I mean, that was back in the 60s, and we're still talking about this, except it's on the left. I mean, nobody's on the right is talking about this. It's just her and people on the left.
And Valerie, imagine if someone white had said something similar.
I think that they would be absolutely slammed. But at this point, I don't think that anyone loves anything that's coming out of Jasmine Crockett's mouth because she is full of it.
Except maybe the Republicans. Anyway, guys, thanks a lot. We'll take a quick break here. Up next on the Lion Week in Review, our panel picks their favorite story of the week. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned as the Lion Week in Review rolls on. Welcome back to the Lion Week in Review. I'm Chris Stigall, back with the panel, Michael, Josh, and Valerie. We always like to wrap up each show by pointing out specifically some stories that the panel really likes. They want you to pay close attention to, and we start with you, Valerie, this week.
Yeah, so I'm going to direct you to a story about a Washington representative. Her name is Christine Reeves, and she compared banning transgender athletes, so men and women's sports, to the Jim Crow era racial segregation. So banning men out of women's sports, she compared it to racial segregation. It doesn't make sense, but read that story.
Josh, what do you think?
Well, I really enjoyed the astronaut story. I think so. Butch Wilmore, this astronaut who was stranded for 286 days, has talked numerous times about his faith and the significance of just knowing and understanding that God has a plan for his life, even during what seemed like a disastrous failure. And he talked also about, he said, we taught our family these things. He has children. And just to think about a parent, a Christian parent, who's not just finding solace in the fact that God has a plan for them, but also instilling that in their children, I think is a great example.
Michael, your favorite this week.
And he said that from the heavens, by the way, which I think was very telling. I got to go back to the Hegseth story where he's bringing back fitness standards that make sense, that aren't by gender, but are universal. And it just goes with the whole Trump agenda, which is returning the federal agencies to their core missions, their original core missions. That's hugely important, but never more important than in the military. Yet they have lower fitness standards, a focus on DEI, diversity quotas, transgenderism. We need to get back to the basics, especially in the military.
Tremendous stuff this week, panel. All of these things we discussed, you can read about in full detail at readlion.com. That'll do it for us this week. Keep up to date on all the latest news. It's constantly breaking at readlion.com. And again, if you missed any of today's show, you can check us out on YouTube. For all of us here at The Lion, thanks for downloading and listening to the show, and we'll see you next week right here.